Now I've lost you, Kayla. Are you still there?
Yes, recording starting.
Okay, thank you. Great, just going to wait for a few more people to connect to audio. Good to see everyone. Thanks for coming, folks. Great. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final day of Europe Week 2020. We're so glad that you could join us. And we are so glad to have this powerhouse event to end our week on. I'm Katie Shanahan-Lintner. I am the interim director of the Center for European Studies. John Stevens, who's with us today, is of course our director on a regular basis, and he's joining from Switzerland today. So we hope, John, that you are enjoying yourself overseas. I wanted to say too that we had hoped very much that this could be a hybrid event. We of course love to have all of our audience members Zoom in from all over. I see some folks zooming in from Europe today too. But the building is being taken over for the next today and the next 2 days for the Rotary Peace Conference. So there was no option for us to do a hybrid event today. In any case, we're glad you're with us on Zoom and hope to see all of you in person whenever possible. So thanks for coming. Thanks to our fabulous panelists. Today, we're going to talk about 100 days of the new German coalition, and we're calling it Initial Results and Future Challenges. We'll focus on the spotlight, or the stoplight, excuse me, I should say, the coalition's first 100 days in government. Of course, the public reception, the hurdles, the election itself, how this coalition came about, and then of course, current issues regarding Ukraine and gas and coal and issues of security, NATO and the transatlantic relationship, among other things. We encourage very much that you ask questions. This is about a discussion. Please put your questions in the chat. I'll be fielding from both hands raised as well as from questions in the chat. And I feel very lucky today to have these experts, these three experts with us today, and I'm going to introduce them all. Christiane Lemke is currently a visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies, was a professor of political science at the Institute for Political Science at Leibniz University, Hanover for many, many years. And this is also not her first rodeo as a CES visiting scholar. She's been a visiting scholar since 1988 at UNC Chapel Hill, was a very important part of getting the center started, and has been an active participant in the center, the life of the center since its inception in 1993. And has been teaching in the Transatlantic Master's Program for well over 15 years, teaching European integration every fall, which we are very grateful for. You've been advising theses and advising students for many, many years, and coming back and giving talks and just really participating in the life of TAM and the center, and we're really grateful for that. You were also the Max Weber Chair at NYU from 2010 to 2014. You also served as the Director of the State Parliament in Lower Saxony from 2006 to 2007. And your areas of expertise include European politics, democracy and governance in the EU, transatlantic relations, of course, comparative politics and political theory, and American politics. And we always look forward to your analysis of US elections and how that plays a role for the transatlantic relationship. And of course, you've published widely. All of these folks today here, I can say, have published widely. So thank you, Christiane, for being here. We're really grateful. Next, Konrad Jarausch is the Lursi Professor of European Civilization in UNC's History Department. You are a co-founder of the Center for European Studies, which of course, as you know, was founded in 1993. And you've been teaching the core course for the European Studies undergraduate majors since the Euro major's inception in 2006. Euro/History 159, 20th Century Europe. And of course, you use your book, your 2015 book, Out of Ashes, A New History of Europe in the 20th Century in that class. And I cannot list all of the European Studies undergraduate majors who just love that class and continuously talk about how it is just amazing to be in your class. So thank you. And most recently in 2021, you published, among the 40 plus books that you've edited and published over your career, Embattled Europe, a Progressive Alternative, which is, quote, a bracing corrective to predictions of the European Union's decline by a leading historian of modern Europe. Professor Jarausch was also director of the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History, or the Zentrum für Zeithistorische Forschung in Potsdam from 1998 to 2006. We are so grateful that you are still such an active part of our center and have been for so many years. And we don't like the fact that phased retirement is in your future. So but we're not going to talk about that today. We're just so glad that you're here and providing your expertise with us. And Holger Moroff is a professor of strategic studies at the National Defense University here in North Carolina. You were a DAD visiting assistant professor or visiting scholar here at UNC for many years. You've taught in Jena and Hanover, and you were also a research fellow at the Institute for European Politics in Berlin. So you bring your transatlantic security expertise to the table today. You focus on security theories in European integration, comparative political corruption, and the internationalization of anti-corruption regimes. You've also edited and published widely, and you've been teaching in the TAM program and advising theses for many, many years, for which we are also very grateful. Thank you to the three of you for being here today. Christiane is going to start our discussion and look forward to the discussion and all of the contributions. Thank you all.
Thank you, Katie, for this wonderful and spirited introduction to our panel. When we planned this event, we did by no means envision the changes that would occur between December of 2021, when the new government took power, and today. I mean, this is a sea change in European politics, in German politics, most certainly. And I would like to start off showing some slides on, first of all, the results of the elections, just to bring us up to kind of the situation in 2021 very briefly. Then I will talk about the coalition agreement, what the coalition wanted to do and what it actually has done 100 days later. I will then talk about the perspective of the German population, what do Germans think about this government, and then very briefly at the end I will talk about some challenges for the future. Thank you, Kayla, for kind of moving these slides. If we could please see the first slide. Very briefly, a timeline. The elections took place in September of last year. We talked about the elections in depth at the Center for European Studies back then. 8 parties in parliament, the most diverse, I should say, composition. We've never had so many parties in parliament. The coalition that was formed there were several options, but the result was the so-called Ampelkoalition, or the Streetlight Coalition, which is a coalition under the leadership of Social Democrats, with Olaf Scholz as the chancellor, following Angela Merkel after her 16 years in office. The Green Party is the second coalition partner, and the business-oriented Free Democrats are the third, and with 52% of all representatives in parliament, it is a stable 3-party coalition. When we talked about this coalition back last year, we did not exactly know how well they would work together, because the parties differed greatly in their platforms and outlooks, but it was, number one, it was surprising how soon they actually did agree on this coalition. In December, early December, the new government took power. And second, we were also surprised how well they seemed to be working together, all kind of emphasizing unity. And so it was actually a strong start. But they were only in office for a very short time when Russia started the war on Ukraine on February 24th, and that changed everything, not only in Ukraine, but also in Germany. And it is really a watershed moment. The term you hear in Germany, Zeitenwende, shows how this is perceived as a sea change. And the turnaround is particularly interesting in the German case. We could briefly look at the second slide. These are the election results, just as a reminder. You've seen this before. The general kind of, in a nutshell, result: decline of the CDU, very, very significant decline of 8%. And surprisingly, the Social Democrats came in as the strongest party. It's a revival of social democracy, which was seen in a deep crisis for the past 10, 15 years. Gains for the Greens, significant gains for the Greens. In fact, before the elections, we thought they would do even better, maybe around 20%, but 14.8% is a very strong showing. And what we clearly see on the left and on the right are losses, great losses for the left, but also the AfD, the far right party, did not do as well as they expected and lost 2 percentage points. So this is the current election result and the composition of parliament. Next slide, please. And here you see how power is divided, which party got which portfolio. A very interesting constellation in the chancellery. Olaf Scholz, Social Democrat, is chancellor, but the vice chancellor is a Green party representative, Robert Habeck, who actually is, according to recent polls, has won in popularity, has a very strong support in the German population. The portfolio's health, which is of course important for the pandemic, and defense and several other ministries are run by Social Democrats. The Greens got one of the most important portfolios, foreign affairs, with Annalena Baerbock, again, another politician who has gained in popularity over the past 4 weeks during the crisis in Ukraine. And the other important ministry, economics and climate policy, run by Robert Habeck, is another big ministry, very important for the first time, combination of economics and climate policy, clearly showing how important climate policy is to the Greens, and they successfully negotiated to have this new extension of their portfolio. The Free Democrats, with Christiane Lemke, got the finance ministry, which is another key office, of course, because it's about money. So the Free Democrats were also successful negotiating in the coalition agreement that finance would go to them, and in addition, a couple of other departments. So this is the current setup of the government, and it looks pretty stable. Well, after 100 years, no major scandals, no kind of resignations. So let's look at the next slide. What did the agreement say? When the parties negotiated from September to December, they came up with a written coalition agreement, Koalitionsvereinbarung, which is basically the program for the next 4 years in government, called Daring More Progress. However, major points changed within these 100 days, basically due to the war in Ukraine. And I picked out 3 points: energy, security, and relations with Russia, to show the change. In energy policy, you read the document and you read a lot about promoting climate change policy, how this should be done, how you should support renewables and phase out the fossil and the nuclear energy sources. And there is no mentioning of Nord Stream 2, which already was very controversial last year and actually since 2016-17. So that was a hot topic, but no mentioning in the coalition agreement. Security, you find passages talking about sending no weapons to crisis regions. That was a broad consensus in unified Germany. And you find a lot of paragraphs about the rules-based foreign policy, about peace and disarmament and cooperation and so on. That's kind of the core doctrine, if you want, for the German foreign policy, and has been actually for the whole post-Second World War decade. In terms of Russia, I quote here, there's talk about an important international actor, about closer cooperation. So it's a very Russia-friendly position here in the coalition agreement. Now, you see the complete turnaround in energy policy. Energy security has become a key topic in German political discourse. It has not been before, to be independent from Russian energy. As you probably all know, Germany receives more than 50% of oil and gas from Russia. But this has completely changed. I just looked at an opinion poll. The majority of the German population is in favor of sanctions against Russia, including an embargo on oil and gas imports. The European Union already put sanctions on Russian coal, but despite the fact that Germany is highly dependent on Russian gas, in particular and oil, because of the war, we see a complete turnaround. And Nord Stream 2 was canceled immediately after the war started. So here again, that's really a turnaround. Sending weapons to Ukraine. I mean, the German government had a hard time in the beginning, and many of us said it would not be wise to send weapons to Ukraine because, you know, there is an ongoing crisis and it would make fighting even more intense and worse. This has changed completely. Germany is sending weapons and just recently announced sending tanks and armament that can actually help and support Ukrainians to push back on the Russian invasion. The other hot topic in security policy has been military spending. And as you may know, German governments have on paper agreed to the NATO guideline to spend 2% of the GDP for the military. But in reality, governments have been dragging their foot, and the Merkel government did not really kind of go forward with 2%. However, this has changed. Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, gave a very interesting speech 2 days after the war in Ukraine started. And he surprised everyone by saying that the German coalition government will allocate 100 billion euro to the German army in a special budget and increase military spending to at least 2% per year immediately. I heard some comments in Berlin that Olaf Scholz had not even consulted with other members of the government, that this was something he came up with overnight, so to speak, and it was not quite clear where the money for the army would come from. But there's broad support for modernizing the German army and for spending this money. It was very interesting that in the parliamentary debate, all parties except for the far right and the far left so including the oppositional CDU-CSU, voted in favor of this measure. In terms of Russia, change could not be more pronounced. Germany immediately supported very tough sanctions that cost Germany a lot, but it was, it was quite clear that the country would go along with NATO policy, with European Union policy, and so on. Immediately, ties were cut, companies withdrew from Russia. I know that in academia that causes a lot of headache because a lot of the Russian-German projects are being suspended and money from the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, from the DAAD, is no longer going to Russia in hopes of putting pressure on the regime of Putin to end the war. So this is the sea change moment here. Let's move on and look at the next slide with, very briefly here, support for political parties is stable. This is the so-called Sonntagsfrage, the question, who would you vote for if we had elections on Sunday? This is from March this year. And you see basically the same results, almost, I would say the same results as in the September elections. There is very high approval for the Ampelkoalition. More than 50% are happy with what the government is doing. There is some criticism of Olaf Scholz as chancellor being a bit too cool and aloof and not enthusiastic enough in this situation of crisis. But overall, it's a pretty stable government. The next slide, please, and that will show us support in the German population. There is wide support, great support for defense spending, according to the survey in March. And you see here that all major parties show a majority of people supporting this policy, including the Greens, which have a pacifist kind of history. Only the far right, the AfD, and the left are divided between people who say that's good and right, and people who say it's wrong, in particularly strong in the party, the left. And that pretty much reflects what the situation is in these parties on the fringes, I should say. They still have not found their new position after the war in Ukraine started. And we can talk more about that in the discussion. The next slide will show us a very interesting result from the same survey from March. Which country can we trust? And the Germans responded, and that's very astonishing. Ukraine is number one, 63% of Germans trust Ukraine. And then, followed by the US. Of course, these surveys kind of have ups and downs, and I wouldn't take them too seriously, but you see here this very, high number is quite significant. And in contrast, Russia is way down here. So there has been a real change in public opinion in that regard. Okay, next slide is my last slide on future challenges. I would like to kind of throw into the discussion 4 points. On energy security, I talked already about the very strong support among Germans to pay a high price for cutting gas and oil from Russia. But we don't quite know how long this will sustain because we're now coming into the summer. We don't need as much heating and so on. But who knows, if the war in Ukraine will last longer, if the sanctions against Russia will last longer, because all of this is not clear at this point in time. We don't know when, the patience will end. In terms of climate change policy, I'm a little bit optimistic. The question is, will Russia's war accelerate the transition from fossil to non-fossil energy sources? And here's actually a chance coming out of the crisis that the transition to renewable energies will be accelerated, and the phasing out of oil and gas in general will be accelerated, even though Germany has to bridge the gap by importing oil and gas from other countries than Russia. But still, it could really give a booster to this policy goal. In terms of refugees and immigration, I've seen in Berlin, when the first Ukrainian refugees arrived in February, great support. Population is very, very supportive. People take in Ukrainian refugees in their private homes even. Poland has taken in the largest numbers of refugees. So there is a very strong support, and this is quite different from the Syrian war and the refugees coming from Syria and Afghanistan. And we can, discuss why that might be the case. But already now, communities and cities like Berlin are overburdened with processing all the papers and supporting the refugees coming in, most of them women and children. So the question is, how many refugees can a country take in, like Germany? And the last point, of course, is inflation. We've seen rising prices at the gas pump, in the food stores. Travel is very expensive. So there is a lot of concern in the German literature and among economists that this type of inflation will actually put a burden on people in the lower income brackets and poor people, in particular people on welfare. So how can Germany kind of avoid to create a real crisis here for people who are less well off? Okay, so that's, from my perspective, kind of 4 points that will be very important for the coalition in the next 100 months, probably. So I would like to turn over to Konrad and to kind of go into some details. And I think we may differ on some positions that I was presenting. Konrad and I have discussed, this whole situation many, many times in the past weeks and months. So please, Konrad, I hand the torch over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christiane, for a very interesting and information-saturated presentation. Indeed, the Ampel coalition government is interesting because it combined three parties with social concerns, environmental issues, and questions of competitiveness, which made a new start after a decade and a half of CDU governments. So expectations were high. There was a sense that new departures, at least in some areas, would be possible, and a kind of a combination in which the SPD, as former government party, would provide security and continuity, and then two new parties in the government, the Greens and the Liberals, would offer impulses for change, for renewal, which otherwise were not available. Now, the question is, how is this working out in practice? Let me start with talking about a government shock. The SPD, as a former coalition partner of the CDU, had government experience, but the Greens and Liberals had been in opposition for a considerable period of time, and therefore were able to create an ideological blueprint of what they wanted, but they would then be hit by the gap between aspirations and possibilities. This is always what happens when the government changes. You have people with ideas and interests that want to transform things, and then only some of those will work. And of course, there's also always a lingering tension between the three parties about conflicting policies. Now, as Christiane has said very convincingly, the Ukrainian war upset legislative plans, and to some degree, some of the commentators also say exposed German naivete, because they had been hiding under the American security umbrella for decades and had developed a kind of moral superiority attitude towards international affairs, where other countries would have to get their hands dirty, but they would somehow not have to do that. And of course, a multilateral and a commercial foreign policy and a rule-based foreign policy, these are all very nice things, and they have been successful for quite a while. But when shocking images of war on the German doorstep, almost one country over, okay, there's Poland in between, and then images of atrocities like Bucha were on television every evening, it's a little bit like the Vietnam effect. They created shock and angst, especially due to the surprise that Kiev actually fought back instead of collapsing immediately, because the assumption of Russian military superiority was strong. And once Putin invaded Ukraine, the idea was that this would not last long. And in effect, of course, the opposite happened, that the invasion of the Russians actually reinforced Ukrainian nationalism, which was a kind of complicated issue before, because some Ukrainians, as Russian speakers and Orthodox Christians, were pro-Russian, and the core of the Ukrainians in Kiev and so on was often Russian speaking, but for Ukrainian independence. And only really the Western part, the Catholic part of Ukraine was pro-Western. And so the question of response came up because the West, of course, had not always done everything right. It had talked about Ukraine entering NATO or the European Union, and then in effect, because of internal corruptions and divisions in Ukraine, had not really done that. And so when there was a strong appeal by the foreign minister and head of Ukraine, Zelensky, for German help, the German government was at sixes and sevens, because it would want to maintain its traditional foreign policy, and yet at the same time, the images were so strong and the appeals were so strong that you could not kind of wave this off. And Professor Lemke has already talked about the spontaneous solidarity with Ukrainian flags everywhere and refugees accepted, and a change in the public discourse in terms of Russia, in terms of defense, and so on. And underneath it, I think also a little bit of a sense of guilt that earlier signs of Russian expansionism in Ukraine, in Crimea and Donbass had been ignored, and that ignoring had now come home to roost. So the government response of a fundamental turnaround at Zeitenwende in defense policy and rearmament, in a special kind of fund of 100 billion euros and so on, and a return to Cold War style land warfare was really very strong, very fast, and very massive, putting in question decades of actual foreign policy doctrine. But of course, this does not really happen overnight because there are too many people who have been involved in other kinds of policies. This comes up in the initial prohibition of arms export into a war zone and the opposition to a no-fly zone, because the danger is, of course, World War III. And what should one do? It is one thing to upgrade one's own military. It is another thing to become actively involved in the conflict. Similarly, the issue of sanctions is still in many ways unresolved. Nord Stream 2 has been stopped, but the question of where to get other energy sources in order to get rid of the Russian dependence has not been resolved yet. There will be no doubt a building of liquid gas terminals and a shift away in coal. We have seen that already from Russia. And in some ways, this helps the Green Party and the demands for rapid increase in renewables like wind and solar and so on. But the question is, how fast can this be done? And will this have military consequences for the war? Will this really help the Ukrainians sufficiently in order to fight against the Russians? And of course, there is the collapse of Russian policy, which is understandable because the Germans had more trade and longer relations with Russia than the United States, which has only a small percentage, I think 3% or whatever, of its trade with Russia, and therefore can call for sanctions without hurting its own economy. Whereas from the 19th century on, just starting with Siemens and so on, there's been a very dense kind of set of relationships between German business and the Russian business. And what to do about that is not clear. And on the Russian policy, of course, decades of dialogue, of St. Petersburg dialogue, of city partnerships, and other sort of civil society kind of connections have created in Germany a strong group of people who are wanting to deal with Russia in a positive way. And in Russia, of course, also have created intellectuals and civil society people that are critical of Putin. So this has not been completely wasted, but in the present situation of a major land war, it is no longer feasible to maintain that. And the question is, can you even negotiate with Russia after all the times that Putin has lied in the past? So that, yes, negotiations are going on, and Germans have tried also to do a certain amount of mediating, using their connections, but how possible is this and how credible will this be? So the fundamental issue for German policy is how far to reposition. What can they actually really do in order to bring peace back to Europe? Can you maintain a new version of Ostpolitik of trying to deal with Russia, hoping to calm them down and to limit their military engagement? Well, what can you do? Is Finlandization an issue? One of my MA students a long time ago wrote a nice thesis about this, meaning neutrality on the military level towards Russia, but strong pro-Western civil society, commercial relations, and so on. Is that a possibility? Or what kind of compromise is it possible? How does one get the Russians back into a civilized behavior? What can Germany do in the future? These are challenges that are problems that are still unresolved. I think let me quit here and turn it over to Holger.
Thank you, Konrad. Thank you, Christiane. This is a panel with heavy German accents, right? All three of us, more or less. And security was supposed to be just one element of the 100 days new government, but it seemed to have sucked all the oxygen out of the room. And I'm glad that you provided already so much detail so we don't have to go into the 100 billion emergency or special budget for the military, 2% of GDP spending on the military. But maybe we can focus on the big security question that Konrad alluded to. You said decades of security doctrine has been upended by the full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. And I think that's very much true. Currently, I'm teaching officers here at Fort Bragg, and one of the things they read is this book. And there you have lots of major military conflicts, the Napoleonic Wars, and how Prussia and Russia and other countries reacted to this kind of conflict. And little did I know that this kind of reading would become more relevant than I have ever wished for. But to appreciate the sea change, as Christiane called it, in foreign policy and military policy, we have to go back, I think, to the 1990s. There was only one game in town, or in the towns of Brussels, Bonn, and Berlin, which was German foreign policy and European foreign policy. And it was to prevent that Eastern and Central Europe and the Soviet Union, to prevent this region from a violent disintegration like we have seen in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Because these were and still are multi-ethnic states. And at the time, some of them had nuclear weapons, including Ukraine. This is where the 1994 Budapest Memorandum stems from. Sovereignty is guaranteed for Ukraine, and they give up the nuclear weapons to Russia. This was the nightmare in the 1990s. And Germany's response was to dangle the carrot of EU enlargement and NATO enlargement so Eastern and Central Europe would not disintegrate violently. They all had to sign the conventions on minority rights protections. They all had to show good neighborly relationships in Yugoslavia and in the East European countries that were to accede to the European Union. Very much like the Marshall Plan was laid out, that former arch enemies, France and Germany, had to show good neighborly relationship, which was the seeding element of European integration. This was the only game in town. And for a brief time in the late 1990s, under Prime Minister Chernomyrdin, even Russia was considered to be a potential member of these enlargement rounds. And the Soviet Union in 1990 with the NATO summit did most for the survival of NATO than any member state, because it asked that the Soviet Union and Russia be crossed out as an enemy of NATO, as the reason for being of NATO. And then again in 2008 and 2014, with the wars in Georgia and then the annexation of Crimea, Russia gave another lease on life to NATO, because here it then appeared as the kind of a new enemy. For Germany, throughout the post-World War, it was World War II era, it was important that they could live in secure borders. This was the raison d'etre of Ostpolitik, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe process. And Brezhnev and the Soviet Union wanted the same. They wanted to recognize the post-World War II borders in Eastern Europe. So I think this is the large security game that has been played out over the last 30, 40 years, you could say. The conundrum was that enlargement meant for Germany that it's now encircled by friends. Enlargement solved the German question, if you wish, of special rate of modernity, of Mittellage being squeezed in between. But it helped create the narrative that's now being used by Russia as NATO and the EU has been encroaching on the former space of the Russian Empire, the Russian sphere of influence. So this is the very big story, and the sea change cannot be overestimated, because now the question remains, how are you going to deal with such an aggressor? It came as a sequence of perfect storms, I would say. First, you had the threat of the United States disengaging from Europe and disengaging from NATO under President Trump, which really changed the mood in Germany. And then you had the reality of a reassertive and now belligerent Russia, which led to the overnight 100 billion euro budget for the military. It's another question whether this is wise to be spent in a way that's outside the regular budget. You upend foreign policy, military policy, economic policy, and the whole doctrine of change through exchange, change through trade, change through rapprochement, right? Wandel durch Annäherung. All this, which has been even before the Berlin Wall fell, was the Ostpolitik, the Eastern politics of Germany. And this is being put into question. And it's being put into question at a time when the more pacifist parties, parts of the Social Democrats, and certainly the Green Party, is in power again. And I say again because military doctrine was put in question in 1998 as well, when you had a social democratic and green government with a green foreign minister. And it was, of course, the ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia, the Kosovo crisis. And it was the chairman of the Green Party and then foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, who changed the narrative from never again war, emanating from German soil, to never again Auschwitz, to never again ethnic cleansing. So leading the way to the fact that the German military could be used outside NATO territory, outside NATO area. Big sea change led by a pacifist green, or formerly pacifist green foreign minister. We have a very similar situation right now. If the Green Party and the Social Democrats were in opposition, the situation might be much more tricky. And this is underlining another element of German foreign policy, at least on the left, for the Green Party, the value-based foreign policy, where human rights and minority protection play an outsized role, which of course has to do with the interpretation of German history. And this feeds directly into the narrative of Vladimir Putin, who talks about historical nihilism. Historical nihilism for him, if you denigrate your own people history. This is why he cut the funding and outlawed Memorial that looked into the Stalinist terror, and he's celebrating Stalin again. And of course, Germany is the epitome of dealing with historical guilt, shame, self-loathing, atonement, and coming to terms with a guilt-laden past. And Putin says, this is historical nihilism, you should do the opposite. You should celebrate, whatever your past was, it's your past, your family is family, and so forth and so on. And he is in, I wouldn't say good company, but he is in a lot of company throughout the Western world, including part of the Trumpian Republicans, what they call the culture war, including the Alternative für Deutschland, the alternative for Germany, who also says, let's forget about the bad things in history. And this is the big narrative. And he paints Western-style democracy as chaos, corruption, and decadence. Of course, he's feeding into the chaos, corruption, and decadence by supporting financially and otherwise nationalist, populist, fringe parties in France, in Germany, in Britain, and maybe in the United States. Again, you could say it's a time-honored Cold War tradition where the Soviet Union financed all kinds of conflicts in the West, not least race conflicts, to show the Western style of democracy is about chaos and decadence. And so these big narratives truly converge. So the Ukrainian, the Russian crisis, and the German interpretation of the past have very strong connections, not only in rhetoric, but also in rhetoric. Putin talks about denazification, right? 77 years ago, 27th of January, the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, right? World War II was the great patriotic war that galvanized all the ethnicities in the Soviet Union, that made the Soviet Union the kind of identity-forming collectivity that Putin now believes the Russians have inherited, and Russians should rule this kind of empire. On many levels, what is happening in Ukraine is connected to the German past, to how Germans deal with history in general, and how this is diametrically opposed to how Putin would want to deal with history. The other level is, of course, which kind of regime is acting here. But it's an authoritarian regime that has monopolized economic power as well through oligarchs. It's a very small and tight-knit family of people around Putin. And this is exactly how Ukraine was run as well. Ukraine was run in the same manner under Kuchma, Yushchenko, Yanukovych, Poroshenko, and Zelensky, we don't know. Zelensky came to power as an anti-corruption crusader. And here might be the true reason, or one of the true reasons, that drove Putin to do what he did, to invade Ukraine. Right, a functioning democracy in Ukraine would have challenged his own legitimacy. He locked up Navalny, the anti-corruption crusader in Russia. He outlawed Memorial, right, the institution that looks at Stalinist and other authoritarian crimes in Russia and the Soviet Union. He helped Lukashenko when he was threatened by an anti-corruption movement. And Zelensky was, of course, a great anti-corruption crusader in Ukraine. And seeing him win the election and prosecuting the previous president, Poroshenko, but of course now in the time of war, he has been let off the hook, if you wish. But this all threatened Putin as a regime. And he came into power without much political backing. And he gained political backing by waging war in Chechnya. With many dirty tricks and with no regard for his own population. And if this is the lesson he learned, that you gain political power by waging war, and he learned that the West didn't push back in Georgia 2008, didn't push back on Crimea and the Donbass 2014, 2015, then he is set up to wage this war until he feels secure and safe in his political position again. And this is indeed a very dangerous situation. I believe that he feels cornered, and German foreign policy is at a loss. It might help, feed into climate change and whatnot. But as far as diffusing a highly dangerous situation in Moscow, Germany doesn't have many cards to play. It's the United States that calls the shots. And without the United States, the situation would be utterly uncontrollable. And I think my silence speaks to the fact that I don't see a ready-made solution. Do we have a long insurgency in Ukraine for years to come, as Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, said yesterday, at the doorstep of Europe? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with a president that now stands for war crimes? He is not a Slobodan Milosevic. This is not Serbia. This is not a small nation. This is a very large one with nuclear weapons of all kinds, small and big ones. It's a country that's being supported by Xi Jinping of China, and India feels also lukewarm about it. He can sell his coal and gas and oil on the world market. China feels it has the upper hand now on many levels. First of all, its own legitimacy might be threatened by a functioning democracy in Taiwan. So seeing what Putin does to Ukraine feeds into their own policy. It's now in a very strong position towards Russia, so it could break Kazakhstan away from its economic union because Russia depends on China's support in this situation. This turns into a big power competition game of global implications. And it's not only about minority rights and human rights, which are horrible, and we talked about the power of the images and the media, and we will see more of what we saw in Bucha, and we will be reminded of the wars in Yugoslavia. But behind it are truly big power competition games that have not been behind the Yugoslavian war, which will make it much more intricate and much more difficult to deal with. And I think Germany is at a loss. You can cut off ties, but it will hurt Europe and the West a lot. And Russia will be able to sell their own resources elsewhere. And you cannot shame and blame Putin into stepping down, right? Or whatever. And so this is a conundrum, a very big conundrum. And the sea change is real and big for German foreign policy. If you look at less grave matters, of course, you could say all security ministries with security elements are now in the hands of women. The foreign policy, right, Annalena Baerbock, we talked about, but also the defense ministry, the social democratic woman, the domestic and home affairs ministry, the justice ministry, they come from all different parties, right, Justice FDP, home defense from the social democrats. So throughout the three parties of the traffic coalition, you have women in charge of security ministries, which is the first in German history. I don't know how much it will help in the situation right now, but we know that both Putin and Trump did not like the former female chancellor of Germany, also for chemistry reasons, I believe. The chemistry of the strong man is not the chemistry of, that was the chemistry that Chancellor Angela Merkel exuded. And I don't think it's the chemistry that Annalena Baerbock exudes. So there is a strong difference in personality and chemistry. How much that is important in negotiations among leaders of countries, we shall see. But we saw that the Minsk agreement that was supposed to pacify the frozen conflict in the Donbass did not work out. And it was negotiated by Angela Merkel in the leading position. It was the showcase of French-German foreign policy. Didn't need the United States or the European Union as a large actor. And this Minsk process has failed. There we are again back at Ukraine and the big power competition question. And I don't have an answer to how Germany should proceed in this situation. I see the difficulties, but maybe a good analysis and underlining the conundrums and paradoxes that we are facing is a first step. Before you come up with a workable answer, a good analysis is probably the best base. Okay, I will end it here. Also given our time, 1 o'clock, 1:03.
Thank you so much to the three of you, really, for all this important information and raising also a lot of questions, which I think we all face or are all thinking about on a regular basis. And unfortunately, the answers elude us. So I would like to give you, Christiane and Konrad, a moment to respond. And then I, of course, have about 12 questions I could ask, which I won't, but and then would like to open up to the group. Please start putting your questions in the chat. Audience members, please do that, and then or raise your hand and I'll call on you so you can ask it out loud. Thank you. Konrad or Christiane, how would you like to respond?
Christiane, please, first.
Yeah, as someone who is teaching international relations, I would like to underline what Konrad says, that the current situation is putting in question decades of foreign policy doctrine. And we already see in Germany a very controversial debate about what went wrong in 40 years or after German unification in foreign policy. And Konrad was, and also Holger, you were both very skeptical about the rule-based foreign policy principle. I would like to defend this concept of the rule-based foreign policy, because I see that at the heart of the Ukrainian crisis. The violation of sovereign states' rights, the territorial issue, crossing the border into another state. I mean, in a rules-based international order, this is a no-no. And I think we should continue stressing that. You know, you cannot and should not accept violating the borders of other countries, especially in Europe, where we are so closely connected by history. Borders have been changed many times. And so it would actually upset a lot of principles that we thought are correct. The moral problem we have is that we stand at the sidelines watching how Ukraine is being basically in many areas destroyed. And it is not only a German policy to say NATO is not going to intervene. It is Jens Stoltenberg, it's the US administration saying NATO is not going to get involved directly. This is why we do not support a no-fly zone. On the other hand, because, and Konrad alluded to this, the threat of a third world war, which God forbid nobody wants. At the same time, NATO is trying to do everything to encourage and support Ukrainian resistance, Ukrainian fighting. I found it very interesting, and I heard that yesterday in our center's discussion on Ukraine, which Milada Vakudova hosted, that the Ukrainian scholars argued there is a genocide against Ukrainians going on. And that is an interesting, I would say, new development in the discussion about what's happening in Ukraine. And Holger rightly pointed to the case of Kosovo, when the red-green government in 1999 decided to participate in NATO bombing of Serbia to stop the genocide against the Kosovo Albanians. And that was kind of a paradigm for a red-green foreign policy to say, if there is a genocide, we will participate in military actions. And I wonder, you know, if that is kind of the line that will be crossed in this case, if there is, you know, and scholars disagree, that, you know, we already can talk about a genocide against Ukrainians. So that's still in discussion. But will that lead to a policy of this government to say, now we need to intervene militarily because of our history? I think, bottom line, history can only tell us so much, and it does not, it should not shape foreign policy in the face of this tremendous threat that Russia is posing to Europe in general. So feeling responsibility and even guilt towards the people in Russia, most war dead Second World War were from the Soviet Union, should not lead us to say we can never, fight against Russia again, because we are faced with a very different situation. German leadership is required in the future. It's the largest country in the European Union. The European Union tries to develop a common foreign and security policy, and Germany will have to play a major role and will not be able to hide behind the US and say, you go first, and we provide money and good moral support. On the contrary, I think that in the future years, there is a great expectation that Germany is playing a more active role in European foreign and security policy. And it's interesting that it is a left of center, red-green FDP government that will actually champion this change. Okay, so far my thoughts here.
Okay, one of the things that is in my mind is the parallel in the second half of the 1930s to the Putin strategy, where Hitler used the lever of self-determination, of ethnic kind of reunification or reintegration of German speakers who had never really been part of Germany before, in order to justify the expansionism. And the question here is, of course, appeasement and Munich. The question is, how do you deal with a dictator in a kind of situation where there is no domestic opposition? Do you sign agreements like the German-Polish non-aggression treaty of 1934 or the Anglo-German naval agreement of 1935 and so on? Is this worth the paper that it's written on when you're dealing with somebody who is responding in a different way, who is not believing in rule-based foreign policy or international order? And I think this is a kind of a general abstract dilemma for the West, and maybe not resolvable in general. But let me just say, appeasement works if you have a decent fellow on the other side. Chamberlain was looking for an English upper middle class person from public school who was going to behave in a civilized fashion. And that, of course, is a disaster. And the problem that we have now is that Ostpolitik, which helped overturn communism in East Central Europe and even gave the so-called Soviet Union a chance to join a Western and more liberal and democratic kind of system, that policy has not worked in relationship to Putin. And the question is, what other policies are there out there? And one of them, of course, with the Scholz response, is to increase Western strength so that the aggressor cannot count on the West rolling over and playing dead. Now, this is dangerous, but it may be necessary in a general kind of way that Holger Moroff talked about. And there is at least a kind of concrete, more specific possibility which has to do with making it possible for the Ukraine to survive militarily. I keep thinking of the Spanish Civil War and the arms embargo, which did not hurt Franco because the reactionaries did not obey it, but it hurt the Republicans. And a similar situation was in the Bosnian War. If the people whom you actually want to support, if you do not give them the wherewithal, then you're basically enabling the aggressor. And the question here is, how does the West develop, and how does German foreign policy develop a new kind of foreign policy and military doctrine that is strong enough to deter further aggression and make it possible for the Ukraine to survive without getting NATO involved in what could become a first local and then regional nuclear war.
Thank you. So we do have some questions that are all very related to what you've just been discussing. So I'll just read them out, and then you can, there are three that are all related to one another and to what your point just now, Konrad, to clarify some things. So what is the view in Germany on the idea of providing fighter jets to Ukraine, right? So how does this is clearly controversial. And then the question about, can Germany assist militarily outside of the NATO context? Russia has already violated a neighbor. How does this, what does this individual country versus NATO as a whole? So if you could please, and then one more question. How committed is the German government to ensuring that Ukraine defeats Russia? How far is it willing to go? So again, this question of, have they considered the fallout if Ukraine is destroyed as a nation? At some point, do not the consequences of a Ukraine defeat and genocide override the fears of NATO countries intervening? So again, this idea of the fear of nuclear conflict, and how does this, when do we get to the point where we need to do more? So Holger, do you want to start?
Sure, big questions. I mean, fighter jets, I think, are out of the question for now. But of course, Germany has ended its policy of not exporting weapons into war zones, first by allowing the Dutch government to sell German-made anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, which is part of the weapons agreement. When Germany sells weapons, that they have a veto on the end use. So if it's resold, then they have to ask the German government, and the German government gave the green light. This was the first signal of a sea change in this policy. Individual member countries can support, and it would not involve NATO. Article 5 is if a NATO country is attacked, then the whole of NATO will defend. But if an individual country sends heavy weapons, and I know that the Czech Republic was thinking about sending tanks to Ukraine, this would not necessarily involve NATO. The question of fighter jets came up. Poland wanted to give fighter jets, but didn't want to deliver it itself, because then it could have been construed as a belligerent party. So Poland wanted NATO or the Americans to send those fighter jets. So these are very intricate legal questions. What is the threshold that needs to be crossed before Putin would say, hey, Poland, Czech Republic, whoever, is now a belligerent party by supplying certain kinds of weapons, for instance? I think it's a very difficult question to answer. The other one was defeat of Russia. What do you mean by defeat? You're not looking at an unconditional total surrender of Russia. How should that come about? So you're looking for a workable peace, maybe a muddle-through peace. And this would have to involve security guarantees that are much stronger than the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 that was signed by Britain and France and Russia. Those security guarantees then must involve triggers that call for joint defense of Ukraine if its sovereignty is ever being threatened by Russia or anybody else. Borders then need to be redrawn, need to be agreed upon. This would be a defeat of Russia in the sense that their war aims have been denied. The war aim was regime change in the very beginning, a quick regime change and take of Kiev that is already being denied. Other war aims might be part of the territory or the whole of territory and all this stuff. So in this sense, defeat is by denying the enemy the war aim, which has already been done to a certain extent, but that needs to be defined. It all comes back to the rules-based order. We are used to living in a rules-based order in the West, in Germany, since World War II. And there are certain regions of the world that operate very much according to the rule of law. And when something breaks down in this zone of a rules-based area, it triggers anxieties for good reasons. There are other parts of the world that are not rules-based. And if things break down, it's part of their fragile, weak statehood and non-existent rules. And you find it even within the West. Violence in a ghetto in the United States or in certain zones in other parts of the Western world is very different from violence in the peaceful suburbs. And that has nothing to do with racism or not. It has something to do with you are used to live in this rules-based system and now it's being threatened. Whereas you have zones of exclusion inside the rules-based systems and their violence plays a different role. Okay, that's all for me.
Okay, if I can say a word or two, I completely agree with you on the arms issues. I would assume that more circuitous ways will be found in order to support Ukraine, especially in as much as the Ukrainians are still willing to fight and capable of holding at least some of the Russian incursion at bay. Russian defeat, I don't see that either. That is a vast exaggeration of Ukrainian possibility. If Ukraine manages to survive the Russian attack with only minimal territorial losses, that is, I think, a war aim for the West, because that alone is realistic. And on the German thing, in order not to get it into a long discussion, I think normalization in as much as other Western countries, France and Britain, is now necessary after decades and decades. At the end of World War II, the kind of new Sonderweg in foreign policy and military policy of the Germans has run out. This does not mean that one gets rid of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, but it does mean that one cannot hide any longer behind German crimes of the great grandparents or great grandparents in order to accept responsibility for their own survival and for Europe in the future.
Thank you, Konrad and Holger. Christiane, I'm going to go to another question. Is that good? And then you can weigh in. So this is also, again, a kind of specific question, but I think folks are really trying to understand this, individual country versus NATO response, right? So if a NATO country unilaterally aids Ukraine militarily and is then attacked by Russia in retaliation, does Article 5 require NATO to defend that neighbor? So from my interpretation, Article 5 says yes. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the NATO alliance has certain ground rules, and in the past years, we've heard a lot from NATO leaders saying we have certain values that we support, and part of this kind of NATO consensus is that NATO is a defense alliance. It was not built to attack another country or to reconquer land or whatever. And that's the big difference between, the Russian army, which has practiced attacking other countries or regions, even in its own country, and NATO, which is why I think, this kind of understanding of being a defense organization and also being an organization that supports peacekeeping and peace enforcing once we have, some end of this war. And as part of this, Article 5 says if a country, a NATO member, is attacked, we will step in and defend this country. So yes, let's say Russia attacks Poland because Poland sent heavy weapons or planes even. Yes, NATO has to come in and defend this member country.
Right.
Ukraine is trying to argue that we are part of Europe. Ukraine is part of Europe, and we've been promised NATO membership. So come and defend us because we're almost NATO members. And Konrad rightly pointed out that this perspective was held out to Ukraine after 2004 to become a NATO member, but it was never really followed up on. There was no plan, step 1, 2, 3, how Ukraine could then become a member after they fulfilled certain conditions, and so on. So the answer from my perspective is yes. I briefly want to say that I do agree with Konrad and also Holger. What does defeat mean? At this point in time, I think a situation in which Russia says, okay, fine, we now have the Donbas region under our control and it's supposed to be part of Russia, and we have Crimea, and we don't want any more. That could be one outcome. Then the West really has to make sure there is no more appetite, no more aggression on the side of Russia, so that there is a workable peace, as Holger rightly said. And sometimes it might be better to have an unjust peace, because of course it is under international law illegal to seize land from another country. But then to have what some people call a just war for whatever cause. But that's, of course, from my perspective, one of the major challenges also for Germany. The Minsk agreement did not work. So can we have a better Minsk agreement, more like the Dayton agreement for Bosnia-Herzegovina, which did work, and it included, it required a lot of international activity in that case, and the NATO forces are still there in the Balkan regions. So that's, from my perspective, one of the most interesting questions for the next couple of weeks. Workable peace.
Workable peace, yes. Let's hope sooner rather than later. I have one last question, if I may, that I would be curious on your perspectives and whether there's the new coalition would maybe provide a different response, but this is about the refugee situation. So, we see this large influx of Ukrainians into Europe, into Poland, into Germany. And the response has been very different from the refugee situation in 2015. And there are various theories about why that is the case, whether lessons learned from 2015 are being implemented. Some say no, whether it's a question of Ukrainians being seen as Europeans versus Syrians not being seen that way. So I would just be curious, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I would be curious to your thoughts on that. Would anyone like to?
The refugee situation for the Ukrainians is a bit different from the situation of other refugees. As you may know, there is a visa-free travel between Ukraine and the European Union that was established 2 or 3 years ago, I believe. So Ukrainians could travel freely and work in EU member countries, including Germany. I just know that there are many Ukrainians now in Poland and in Germany, regular citizens working. And of course, this is a good situation to integrate and to bring in the refugees that are coming now, because they might have relatives who are already in the EU or friends who are already in the EU. And this was very different, and you avoid a lot of legal, issues that are involved, giving refugees a legal status and entitlement to health and social assistance. And that was very different from the previous refugees coming from non-EU countries in Africa and Asia and so on. You had legal hurdles, but you also had a cultural hurdle, and many of the Ukrainian refugees seem to fit better into a European perspective of a newcomer. And we see that very clearly in countries like Poland and Hungary, which did not accept refugees through the EU mechanism coming from Syria and Afghanistan, but are now very welcoming, in particularly Poland. And it's still the same government and national center-right government. So the cultural fit seems to be better in that case. And you can be very critical about it, but if it helps refugees, so be it. I mean, that's the humanitarian aspect that we're most concerned about.
Yes, thank you. So we're right at time. I really want to extend my gratitude to Christiane, Konrad, and Holger for being here today, for giving your perspectives. It's clear there are many questions still open. We will see, but to hear your thoughts, the history, the interconnectedness, the interdependence, the questions, this sea shift is really important for us to keep this conversation going, to have a better understanding of what's happening, to understand the regulations of NATO and to help us. I think that we're all feeling this enormous sense of urgency that something really needs to happen, that we're all looking for ways to support ending this situation as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So I did also want to say, if anyone is interested in finding ways to help Ukrainians, Razom is for Ukraine is a great way to do so. The organization this is something that we're also hearing from our Ukrainian colleagues and scholars in Ukraine who are saying this is one of the best ways to help. So thank you so much to the audience for joining today. Thanks to all who participated in Europe Week all week. Sometimes we have Europe Week all the time and lots of events. So please continue to tune in to what we have going on. There'll be more in April, and then maybe some summer activities, but please stay tuned, read the newsletter, and thank you so much to the three of you again for being here today.
Thank you, Katie, for organizing this event.
Of course.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good weekend.